Hello. I don't know how well you can see this, but I'm wearing a nice little hat that's going to talk about. It's called a tri-corner hat because it has three corners on it, like a triangle. And it's designed for kids, so it's a little small. Sorry if you couldn't see it very well in the lighting. I'm talking about this today, your second part of Fighting the War lesson. And this talk, the two pages on 172 and 173 compared the two armies. Now, at the beginning of the war, the British had the biggest advantage. They had the best army in the world, the best navy in the world. They were professional. They were professional army and navy. Where the Patriots, the Continental Army, was just basically made up of volunteer soldiers that were farmers, shopkeepers. They didn't have a lot going for them. And what you read some things about the British Army on page 172 is they also had mercenaries. Mercenary is soldiers from a different country that are paid. So basically, they're paid to do this job. The most famous ones that the British hired were called Hessians from Germany. And you can see on my screen here is a picture of a Hessian soldier. And the British hired many of them to come over from Germany to fight in the war. The British also had support in the colonies from loyalists. Loyalists were people that we had talked about from before. They were called loyalists because they were loyal to the King of Great Britain. They did not want to separate. But the British also had some disadvantages, some weaknesses. They were fighting thousands of miles from home. So it took a while for supplies to get across the ocean to help them. They fought different than what the Continental Army did. The British liked to stand in rows and just fire at the enemy that way, where the Americans like to do a little more hiding and sneak attack, things like that. Another disadvantage the British had was their coats. We call them red coats. It's easy to see the red, so they make perfect targets with that red. You can see them easily. And another problem they had is back home in Great Britain, not a lot of people were happy with this war because they had to pay more taxes. Now we talk about the American Army. The biggest strength they had is something to fight for. We call it the cause. And the cause in this case was independence. And so that made them more inspired to fight versus like the British. They were just there because that was their job. They were paid to be there. The Americans did have one advantage, which was a Kentucky long rifle and other rifles. Rifles were were better than a standard musket. A rifle, it refers to a gun where the barrel has grooves in the barrel, so when the bullet fires, it causes that bullet to spin. And when you spin it, it'll make that bullet go in a straighter line. Think of like a football. You watch a quarterback throw a football, if it's in a nice tight, what we call spiral, it's going to go straighter. But if it wobbles, it's going to be a little less accurate. So if your gun had rifling or grooves in it to make that bullet spin, or musket ball, will be an advantage to you. Some major weaknesses or disadvantage that the Americans had was they didn't have as many men. Washington had trouble keeping soldiers in his army because they only signed up anywhere between 6 months to a year, which caused some problems because you have soldiers coming and going. And it's hard to train an army when you have soldiers leaving all the time. Equipment was also another problem for the Continental Army. They didn't have a lot of it. And it was really hard for them to get shoes. Because remember, up to this point, they had done a lot of their trading with Great Britain to get those goods like that. But now they're at war with Great Britain. They're not trading with Great Britain anymore. So now on your screen, I'm going to show you some more pictures about kind of the uniform and equipment that they had during this war. And anytime you want to look more closely at the picture, just go ahead and pause the video. So we'll start here. As I said, this is a Hessian soldier. The next picture is an example of a red-coated officer. So this would have been a British officer, you can tell because of the red. And an officer is somebody that would have been the leader. And so they had a little fancier-looking uniforms. Now, these are epaulets from General Washington's uniform. You're like, what are epaulets? Well, you'll be able to see in the next picture. So these things like this, they would go on the shoulder of the officer. I'll zoom in a little bit. So they would have been up on his shoulder. It's basically there as a fancy look saying, I'm an officer, I'm in charge. So those are the actual things that were on George Washington's shoulders. Here is an example of a Continental officer's uniform. It's blue, so the Patriots typically wore blue. And again, an officer is somebody that was in charge. This is what an officer would have looked like. Now, the Continental Army did a better job of supplying their officers than they did the regular enlisted soldiers. So sometimes that made it so the soldiers didn't like their officers because the officers had better treatment and better equipment. Here's an example of a regular soldier's Continental uniform. Typically, these uniforms would have been made out of wool. Now, in the background, you see this silver-looking thing. That would have hung around their neck, and it would have been for an officer's. Really didn't do anything. It was just there for looks. A couple other things I'll point out in this picture. This horn-looking thing is called a powder horn. And in order to fire a musket, you need gunpowder. And they would hold that gunpowder in the powder horn. Here, right in the middle, is a sword. Typically, it was just the officers that would carry swords into battle. They could be used to fight, or they could also be used to signal your soldiers where to go. And here is an example of a musket that would have been used during the Revolutionary War. In a separate video, I will talk about the weapons of the war. Here, I just threw this picture in. You can just to show you kind of the style of clothing that they would have worn during this time. There were sometimes disagreements within the Patriot Army or the Continental Army, and this just shows that one time they had a fight. But if you look in the background, you can see this would have been an officer looking with the blue and those epaulets that we talked about. That's an example of what they would have looked like. And then some soldiers would have had different dress like this. So they all really didn't have the same matching uniform. The Continental Army itself probably would have, but if you were a militia, remember we talked about militia were those part-time soldiers that would just come together in an emergency, they probably would have worn whatever they could have gotten from home. So you need to have a wallet also back then to hang on to your money. So this is an example of a wallet, a pocketbook that somebody in the Continental Army would have had. Here's another example of the tri-corner hat that a colonist probably would have worn. So, and here's just an example of some sort of bag that would have carried something. I'm going to go back for a second here. It says, this large leather bag was part of Washington's mobile headquarters. It is one of the luggage bags that carried his sleeping and office tent and his bedding. His enslaved valet, so Washington did have slaves with him, William Lee, along with his other servants, slaves, and guards, packed these bags every time the army moved to a new camp. After the war, Washington carefully provided for the preservation of this bag at Mount Vernon. That's where he lived. It came to represent his status as the American, I'm not sure, Cincinnatus, the general who saved the Republic by returning to civilian life at the end of the war. So this is where Washington's tent would have been kept inside this bag here. And here are just some examples of buttons that could have been on the uniform of members of the Continental Army. If you look close enough on here, they say USA. So I just want to go quickly. Some of these pictures I'm not showing you. But I just want to show you another thing from the British Army. The Dragoons were a loyalist group of colonists. So these weren't British soldiers. They were loyalists. They were people that lived in the colonies. And they formed their own corps. Where it says Loyalist Corps. I know it looks like corpse, but it's pronounced corps. They came together because they wanted to fight the Americans. They were not happy that the Americans were trying to get independence. So these loyalists formed a group, and they were called Dragoons. And they were cavalry. So here is a picture of some Dragoons. Cavalry refers to soldiers that fight on horseback. So again, they were loyalists in the South. The southern colonies are going to have most of the loyalists. And so they formed to fight against the Americans. So they were, again, examples of loyalists fighting the Patriots. So as I said before, there were some that wanted independence, patriots, some that wanted to remain loyalists, and there were some that were in the middle that really didn't know which way to go. But it was really hard during this time not to pick a side. So there will be another video coming that I'll talk a little bit more about what war was like for women during this time. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.